ourselves up about
Oh,
it.
yeah. What's wrong with me?
Exactly. But what if we told you that laziness? Well, it might be a myth.
Myth busted by neuroscience.
Yep. Today we're going deep on this idea that laziness is actually a neurological state, not a character flaw.
And we're basing this deep dive on a YouTube podcast. It goes into the science of motivation, really gets into the nuts and bolts.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Basically, the idea is that your brain might just need the right code,
Yeah.
to unlock the motivation.
It's already there. Just got to find the key.
Exactly. And that's our mission today, to help you understand how your brain is wired for motivation.
And how to work with it instead of against it. No more frustration, no more blame.
We'll be looking at dopamine, the prefrontal cortex, and the basal ganglia.
The big three when it comes to getting things done.
So kicking things off, this idea that laziness is a myth, it feels real, right?
Oh, it definitely feels real. But this podcast we're looking at makes a really strong argument. It says when you're procrastinating or just stuck, it's more about brain function than willpower.
Interesting. So it's not that we're lazy, it's that our brains are, like misfiring?
Sort of. It comes back to those three components: dopamine, prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia. They're central to motivation.
Right. Let's break them down one by one, starting with dopamine, I guess.
Good place to start. Dopamine. It's the go-get-it chemical. It's what gets you started.
Okay, so if you're low on dopamine, you're basically stuck at the starting line.
Yeah, pretty much. This podcast actually gave a hypothetical statistic. They said low dopamine can make starting tasks 300% harder.
300%? Wow. That's not just a little bit harder.
Nope. It puts a whole new spin on things, doesn't it? It makes you think twice about calling yourself lazy.
Absolutely. So dopamine's like the ignition switch.
Yeah.
For motivation.
Perfect analogy. Then you've got the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain.
CEO.
Yeah, it's in charge. Makes decisions, plans, organizes, figures out the what and the how.
So if your prefrontal cortex is overwhelmed, that's going to impact motivation.
Big time. If the CEO's not giving clear directions, nothing's getting done.
Makes sense. And what about the basal ganglia?
That's the autopilot. Habits, routines, the things you do without thinking.
Like tying your shoes.
Exactly. You don't have to think about each step anymore. Basal ganglia's got it covered.
Wow. So if these three systems aren't working together,
motivation takes a hit.
The podcast used a good analogy. It's like a car that won't start. You don't yell at the car.
Right. You check under the hood.
Exactly. Same with motivation. You got to figure out what's going on in the brain.
It's a much more productive approach. Blaming yourself gets you nowhere.
So how do we work with these brain systems? How do we unlock motivation?
Well, let's start with dopamine. The podcast emphasized that dopamine isn't just about the reward.
It's not.
It's also about the anticipation of the reward. That's key.
So it's that feeling of excitement when you're looking forward to something.
Yeah, and that feeling can get you moving. So one strategy is to break down big tasks into smaller ones.
Mini wins.
Exactly. Each mini win releases dopamine, and that keeps you going. It's like creating a trail of breadcrumbs.
And your brain follows the trail. I like that. So what about the prefrontal cortex? The CEO. How do we keep it happy?
Clarity. The prefrontal cortex hates feeling overwhelmed. So instead of a vague goal like get in shape.
Make it specific, like put on my running shoes.
Perfect. A clear, actionable first step. That's what the prefrontal cortex needs.
No more ambiguity. Got it. And what about the basal ganglia, that autopilot system?
Leverage it. Use habit stacking. It's basically attaching a new habit to an old one.
So like after I make coffee, I'll meditate for 5 minutes.
Exactly. You're using an existing neural pathway to create a new one.
Clever. And there are apps that can help with this, right? Habit tracking apps.
Yeah, like Habitica or Todoist. They tap into our love of patterns. Plus, they often give you little rewards.
Dopamine hits.
Right. So you're getting that positive reinforcement. Keeps you motivated.
Okay, so we've got the basics down. Dopamine, prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia. But are there any specific hacks to really boost motivation?
Absolutely. The podcast gave us 4. And the first one is the 2-minute rule.
The 2-minute rule.
It's super simple. Just commit to working on a task for 2 minutes. That's it.
But how does that help?
It lowers the barrier to entry, makes it harder for your brain to say no, and often, once you start, you'll keep going.
Do you trick your brain into getting started?
Exactly. I used to hate doing my taxes, but then I tried the 2-minute rule.
Just 2 minutes.
Yep. Just opening the software. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, I ended up doing way more than 2 minutes.
So it actually worked. That's amazing. Okay, what's the next hack?
Dopamine stacking. Remember how we talked about anticipation?
Yeah.
Well, dopamine stacking is all about pairing a not-so-fun task with something enjoyable.
Like if I finish this report, I can watch a funny video.
Exactly. You're creating your own reward system. Makes those tedious tasks a little more bearable.
That's a good one. What's number 3?
It's all about language. Changing I have to I get to.
Really? Just changing the words.
It sounds simple, but it works. Have to feels like an obligation, but get to feels like a choice.
So you're reframing the task, making it feel more positive.
And that can influence your basal ganglia, makes the task feel less automatic and more intentional.
I'll have to try that. What's the last hack?
Environment design, making it easier to make good choices.
So like keeping your workout clothes out where you can see them.
Exactly. You're reducing friction, making the healthy choice the easy choice.
And the podcast even shared a story about someone who went from couch potato to marathon runner, all thanks to these hacks.
Pretty inspiring, right? Shows you what's possible when you work with your brain.
Absolutely. So the bottom line is this. Your brain isn't lazy. It just needs a little guidance.
And when you feel stuck, don't get down on yourself.
Ask yourself, what does my brain need right now?
Is it dopamine? Clarity. A new habit. Figure it out, and you can unlock your motivation.
It's all about understanding how your brain works and using that knowledge to your advantage.
And the best part is, we're only just scratching the surface. Who knows what other myths about human behavior are waiting to be debunked?
It makes you think, what other hidden potential do we have, just waiting to be unlocked by science?
I guess we'll have to keep diving to find out.
One deep dive at a time. That's all for today. Thanks for listening.
See you next time.